This is an ABC podcast.
This is The Conversation Hour with Richelle Hunt and Warwick Long on ABC Radio Melbourne and Victoria.
Today, what do an opera singer, a ninja warrior, a journalist, and probably even somebody you know, it could even be you, have in common? They all have something, or could have something, called imposter syndrome. A feeling that maybe even subconsciously that they aren't good enough to be there. That at any time someone's going to tap them on the shoulder and say, "I'm sorry, we've made a mistake. You don't deserve to be here."
That's pretty much my entire working life was. I'm waiting for that tap on the shoulder all the time. Now, I didn't know that there was a title that was put onto this feeling. That feeling that even though you've worked really hard, even though you're qualified, even though you do the job that you are paid to do, or that could be in a sporting arena, or it could be in your working life, you feel like maybe you're not the right person for the job, or that maybe someone is going to tap you on the shoulder and say, "Look, I'm sorry, we've made a huge mistake. It wasn't supposed to be you." But this is really common, apparently.
And what's interesting in researching this, and we'll talk about whether it's actually officially a diagnosis and all that sort of stuff. We'll talk about dealing with it as well today in the program. But Richelle, is this something you mentioned that you feel like it's your whole life? Is there anything that sticks in your mind when you think about this?
Absolutely was. I was invited about 10 years ago after covering Black Saturday. I was invited to Canberra for a couple of days to spend time with other journalists from around Australia looking at trauma and reporting. Now, at first I thought the email was spam and was a joke because there's no way they could be asking me, so I didn't believe it. The email came through again. I went, "Oh, maybe this is a real thing." And my boss said, "This is really good. You should go." And I went. And I walked in. I'll never forget the moment of opening up these big double doors into a room full of other journalists. Now, when I say full of other journalists, I'm talking about everyone from Four Corners, AM, PM, all of the tele reporters, from everything from A Current Affair to Today Tonight. Brett McLeod was there.
The big guns, as we call them in the business.
The big guns. And I just stood there and froze and broke into a sweat and thought, they've made a huge mistake. What on earth am I doing in this room with all of these people? And so I went, "All right, sit down, Rich. They'll tell you to leave anytime soon. Just sit down." And I sat down and it turns out I was the right person. But as the questions went on and as the seminars went on, I kept saying, whenever a question was put to me, "Look, I feel like I'm not qualified to answer this," or "I feel like maybe I'm not the right person for this." And I just had to, I guess, accept that maybe I was the right person to be in that room. But it was a really, really strange feeling. So that's a lot of what we'll look into today. Even though you are qualified and even though you are the right person for the job, you feel like maybe you shouldn't be there.
This is The Conversation Hour on ABC Radio Melbourne and Victoria.
And there you heard the beautiful vocal treats of opera singer Sally Wilson. Now, believe it or not, she has imposter syndrome, something that she's working really hard on. We're going to speak to her in just a moment. So this is a woman. You can't fake doing what she does. You can't walk out onto a stage and not be able to sing in an operatic way, Warwick Long. And you would think that someone like her wouldn't have that feeling that many of us have, that at some point somebody's going to walk from behind you, tap you on the shoulder and say, "Look, I'm really sorry, but we've made a terrible mistake. You are not the right person for the job." That is imposter syndrome. And we're talking about it today. So many texts have already come in, haven't they?
Certainly so, Richelle. This one says, "OMG, oh my gosh, I thought it was just me. I always feel like I'm an imposter and I'm in my 50s and have worked in the same industry for over 30 years. Another one saying, "Thanks for talking about this. My whole life is riddled with imposter syndrome." We'll be talking about that today. Richelle, you were telling a story of when you almost felt like an imposter when you were on stage with at this thing with all these people from these huge media companies and programs, feeling like you didn't belong there, even though you'd been covering Black Saturday, which was such a traumatic and a horrific event for our state to face. You definitely deserved to be there, but you didn't feel like you did. When did you notice? Was it while you were there that you were sort of being self-defeating about it, or was it only in hindsight years later did you realise?
Well, the wonderful Lisa Miller, which people would know from ABC Breakfast TV, she was actually coordinating and hosting this particular event. So just to add to my nervousness, here was someone that was a foreign correspondent and that I looked up to. And she actually raised it in the setting that we were in, because this was sort of a closed environment for journalists to speak openly and honestly about what it's like to report on traumatic events. And she said, Richelle, do you realise that before you speak, you kind of put yourself down, or you mention something or say something to insinuate that you feel like you're not worthy of being here? And I said, well, I'm not, I'm just starting out, and, everyone that's here is super experienced. But in actual fact, if I look back on it, I'd been training for years. I was doing voice training, I was doing voiceover training, I'd been producing, and I'd been in local radio and volunteer radio for almost a decade, but I just didn't feel qualified to be there. And I guess to a certain degree, I still feel like that sometimes, because there's always somebody that you aspire to be like. There's always somebody better, and you're always hungry. And in our industry, and I think lots of industries are like this, you're always kind of worried that you might lose your job as well, that somebody better will come along, and before you know it, you're yesterday's news.
Such an interesting insight. Thanks for sharing that today. We're going to talk a lot about this today. Is imposter syndrome something in your life? Did you even know it existed before we were talking about it today? Love to hear your thoughts. Next, we will meet Sally Wilson, opera singer turned change coach.
This is the Conversation Hour on ABC Radio Melbourne and Victoria.
And you just heard the beautiful voice there of Sally Wilson. She is an opera singer. She's now turned, what's labelled a change coach. She describes herself as a trauma buster and a performance empowerer. And you also say on your website that you're supporting stressed out go-getters to ditch their baggage and lighten the hell up. Sally, a warm welcome to the Conversation Hour. How is it that someone with a skill that you have, very few people in the world can do what you do, how do you still feel like an imposter?
Well, look, the truth is that I would say that I suffered from imposter syndrome till about 2 years ago. I don't have it anymore. But when I look back, I had it even in high school, feeling like, gosh, I've got these teachers bluffed. I mean, they think I'm smart. Seriously, what's wrong with them? And during my operatic career, it sort of came and went. But really, look, opera is a skill that you have to work very, very hard at. I would say that the times when I felt like I wasn't enough in whatever way actually spurred me on to do more work. The thing is that the work isn't nearly as much fun when you have that fear drive as opposed to just the joy in growing and developing.
That's such an interesting point. And you've heard Richelle and I try our best to sort of define that feeling that is imposter syndrome. How do you define it when you're talking to people?
Look, it's slightly different for different people, but it's certainly, as Richelle said, it's certainly that sense of being a fake, being a fraud, not being up to the success that you're experiencing, not deserving it. There's a sense of not belonging. There's a sense of not being enough in some sense, whether it's not smart enough, not experienced enough, not whatever enough. And there's that also, as you mentioned earlier, right, that sense, or perhaps it was Richelle, that at some point I'm going to be found out. So there's a real stress behind it, that you're going to be found out and people are going to realise that you are a fraud.
That's such an interesting point, I suppose, when you think about it too, because not once in my life have you ever seen balloons come from the ceiling or these people turn around and say, you know what, we're finally onto you, you've been found out, you better walk out the door. But it's a fear, and it's such a feeling that so many of us can relate to. On this text line, we're speaking to Sally Wilson right now, opera singer turned change coach. Kerry from Reservoir, Lynn from Torquay, Jane have all sent a similar text saying, I want to know if it's more likely that women feel this way or if men feel this at all. Bet you it seems more females than males, says Lynn. Is that the case?
Well, that's an interesting question. So initially, research was around high-performing women in regards to imposter syndrome. But after that initial research was done, we realised with ongoing research that men are just as likely to suffer from it, just as likely as women. The one distinction I would draw to your attention is the fact that usually men don't let themselves be affected by it as much, in the sense that they won't necessarily give in to that little critical voice in their head and change their behaviour because of it.
We're going to be speaking to a psychologist later on about whether or not it's linked to anxiety, whether it's linked to mental health in any way, and whether it's a fair income thing and something that's been studied. But I'm curious to know, is it just people that are in positions where you're in the public, or positions of power, or positions that are looked on as something of importance, or does it happen to all of us in all walks of life, no matter what we're doing, even if we're a stay-at-home parent, that we still feel like we're not good enough? Because I never feel like I'm a good enough mum. I mean, I could imagine it would be an incredible part of parenting.
Yeah, it can happen to any person in any walk of life. And like I said, when looking back, I realised I had it when I was in high school, you know. It's not necessarily people who are, you know, in the spotlight. It's really any of us. I mean, the estimation is that about 70% of us have imposter syndrome at some point in our career. Within that, I would also include in motherhood, in parenthood, you know. So it's really, really prevalent. And also, a lot of people who have imposter syndrome, they do have symptoms of generalised anxiety. Sometimes they have symptoms of depression, chronic stress, and tension, you know, because really where it comes from is it's an unconscious core belief that we've picked up at some point when we're kids, usually 0 to 7. So in that time, we're living life in a hypnagogic trance, which means that we don't have an established critical faculty. We can't reject ideas. We can't really analyse ideas. We just download all of this information as the truth. And if during that time, as most of us seem to have experienced, you know, we pick up the idea that we're not good enough, or we don't deserve success, or we don't deserve what we want, or we don't belong, or it's not safe for me to stand out, you know. If we pick up any of these sorts of unconscious programs, that then becomes a part of our identity, becomes truth to us, and then, of course, that is reflected in the outer world. And so if we're dealing with that, and yet we're pushing through as we do, we push through it because consciously we know, oh, that's ridiculous. I'm smart enough. I'm good enough. I'm experienced enough. This is ridiculous. You know, these are the sorts of conversations we have with ourselves. So consciously we can know that we are enough, but our unconscious is just so much more powerful.
And so, Sally, how much of it then, without blaming our parents for everything, you know, I feel like we're sort of sitting on a psychologist's couch and it all comes back to blaming mum and dad, and I worry about what I'm doing to my daughter every day. But I am curious around the idea of how you were raised and the sort of environment that you're in. And you know how there are some families that are like, go for it, go get it, you know, you can be anything and we'll back you and it doesn't matter if you fall or fail. And then you may be raised in a household where it's like, well, no, you know, sensible, let's be sensible, Sally, if you don't mind the pun here, and let's do something where there's no risk involved. And, you know, how much of how you were raised and the sort of people that you surround yourself with, whether it be parents or grandparents or friends, has an influence on whether or not you feel like you have imposter syndrome?
Well, I'm not into parent bashing either, Richelle. So that's important to point out. It's not about that. I had a very supportive, encouraging, follow your star kind of upbringing. That was my upbringing, and yet I still wound up with imposter syndrome. I don't know exactly how. I don't know what was said at what time and how it affected me at that time. So on one hand, yes, our environment when we're children, it really sets those subconscious programs in place. But at the same time, we can't blame people. I mean, our parents are doing the best they possibly can at any given time. With what they've got. It's not about that at all. It's just about recognising that these programs happen. We do get programmed, during that time. And the important thing here for people to understand is that we can change those subconscious programs, because a lot of people are told, well, look, it's possible to thrive despite imposter syndrome. Well, I would say it's actually possible to get rid of it. I did.
And I really wanted to ask you about that, because you did it and you work with people now to identify imposter syndrome and help them get rid of it as well. How do you do it? We change those neural networks. We change the subconscious programming. Thank you for asking, Woz. Our brain is malleable. Our brain is wired to change. And when we understand how we can change it, we're fully capable of changing those programs. So that's what I help people to do. So fascinating. Thank you very much for taking us through a little bit about what it's like. And you should see the texts coming in, Sally. We're going to be reading them in the next few moments, but we really appreciate your time on the program today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Warwick and Richelle. Thank you.
Sally Wilson, opera singer turned change coach, joining us to talk about imposter syndrome, that feeling that suddenly everyone's going to turn around and say, oh, you don't deserve to be here, even though you're probably insanely qualified, able to do the job. You just don't feel like you belong.